this is Alfie Norris. Welcome to today's episode of Culture of Coal, Wakefield Stories, a podcast series exploring how mining heritage has influenced the culture of the district. This project would not be possible without the support of a Wakefield Council Culture Grant as part of our year 2024. The author David Story, born in Wakefield to a coal mining family in 1933, crystallised a traditional vision of rugby league in his 1960 novel This Sporting Life, following the life of Story's gladiator hero Arthur Mackin. The writer would base many of his works on the sport, firmly rooted in the Wakefield he knew as a young man. In 1963, Lindsay Anderson adapted This Sporting Life to the big screen, a film that captures the smoky realism of Wakefield in black and white. Rugby league today is a firmly modern sport, and far from the macho world of the 50s and 60s that Story portrays. The district plays host to three major teams, Wakefield Trinity, Castleford Tigers and Featherstone Rovers, alongside countless village and community teams, cementing rugby league's place as the people's sport. But this reputation has long roots, firmly entwined in the coal mining heritage of the district. For this episode, I sat down with journalist and author Ian Clayton to learn more about the history of his team, Featherstone Rovers, and the meaning rugby league has for ex-mining communities. So Ian, it's nice to have you here. I just wanted to ask you, so what's your connection into Featherstone and rugby?
I mean, if you're born in Featherstone, you're connected to rugby straight away, I suppose. It's part and parcel of. It's one of the responsibilities of being born here that you are. I don't know. I suppose as a kid, I dreamed of playing for Featherstone Rovers like any other kid did, and I actually was. I played for a short while for the Featherstone Rovers Colts, which was the under-17s team, but I very quickly realised that I wouldn't make it as a professional rugby player, so not happen on that side of it. But I ended up playing amateur rugby for a while. I played for Jubilee Hotel. They had a good side. Vince Farrow used to be coach. Vince is obviously a legend of Featherstone rugby, and he was the coach at Featherstone. I only played for the second team. I didn't play for the first team. Because the first team were as good as professional teams almost. They were really, really good side. They won National Cup in 1984. Imagine that, a pub team winning a national trophy, but they did. And then my last connection to rugby was that I went to train with Featherstone Miners Welfare just to keep fit when I was nearly 40 years old. And then what always happens in situations like that is you train to keep fit, and then one day they're short of a player and they say, will you be a sub for us? And that happened to me, and I said yeah. And I played a game at Dewsbury Moor, I think it was. And that was the start of another couple of seasons of playing again. At that age, I don't think I ever played a full game. I came on as a willing substitute, but I enjoyed playing and obviously watching and knowing and being interested in rugby. So from all different angles, I've had a connection to it. Yeah,
and as a local journalist, author, historian, you've written extensively on the history of Featherstone and the history of Featherstone rugby. So the emergence of rugby as a popular sport, and that's rugby union originally in the 1860s and 70s in Featherstone, is really a legacy of Featherstone becoming a coal mining community. Could you walk us through a little bit of how Featherstone became a prominent mining town and that connection?
Yeah, I'll talk a bit first of all about the writing about rugby. In the early 1980s, Featherstone Rovers grandstand burnt down, and there were a lot of community effort in raising funds to replace the stand after there'd been a fire underneath the stand, and it had destroyed the old wooden stand, and they were finding ways of raising money to build a brand new one. And I talked to there were two men on committee then, Terry Mullaney and Terry Jones, who were both interested in the history of the club. So I said, well, I'll write a book that looks at the history of rugby in Featherstone, and we'll use the when we sell it, we'll donate the money for the rebuilding of the stand. So that's what we did. And I was out of work at time. I used to work on building sites then. I was in between building. You get made redundant when you work on building sites. So I was in a period of where I wasn't working. So I used to go to the library at Ponty almost every day. And I used to glean the local newspaper, the Pontefract and Castleford Express. And I went right back as far as I could and discovered that rugby in Featherstone didn't start with Featherstone Rovers, but started with a cricket team called Featherstone and Purston United in the early 1880s. So rugby had been played in Featherstone 20 odd years before we thought it had. Everybody knows that Featherstone Rovers famously started in 1902 at the Railway Hotel when George Johnson, a barman, was asked by Mr. Umpleby, the landlord, to form a rugby team and play on a field down Post Office Road. But rugby was actually played 20 years before that. And like you say, it was rugby union. Brief history of rugby. 1871, at the Pall Mall restaurant in London, some ex-public school boys put their heads together and decided to draw up the rules of rugby union. And that's how rugby union came to be an organised game. Yet again, from history, we learned that it's the English public schools that introduce things to us. It's not true. They introduced rules and they introduced a form of governance, but people were playing rugby back into bloody medieval times. Every village had its own form of rugby. You still see some ancient forms of rugby played out now. On the 6th of January every year, they play a game in Lincolnshire called the Haxey Hood game, and that's like a sway of village people trying to get a leather cylinder from one end of the village to the other, and it's a very, very traditional form of rugby, if you like, between the villages of Westwoodside and Haxey. And you see other forms of. There's a Shrovetide folk football match in Ashbourne in Derbyshire. All over the place there's these old forms of it. But yeah, the public school boys put rules and governance onto the game in 1871. So that's when the English Rugby Union started. And obviously, I think when public school boys leave school, they come back to the towns where they're from to take up in business or become teachers or solicitors or whatever they do. And they bring this idea of rugby or a team form of rugby back to those towns. That's my understanding. Let's come to Featherstone now, which is a long way from Pall Mall and English Rugby Union Wallers. But in the 1880s, there's a mass influx of coal miners to this town. The mines start opening up round here in the 1870s. By the 1880s, the population has gone from a few hundreds to a few thousands. Predominantly young men. Well, obviously, young men have to have something to do, don't they? So, an outlet for what they do after work. And at the bottom of Featherstone, there was a big rabbit field, which became a playing field as well. So they had rabbit coursing events, hare coursing events, rabbits. They had athletic events, and then they decided to have a rugby field there. And the miners, the young miners, took to play rugby. Rough and tumble, as you might imagine, had appealed to them. And very quickly, the Featherstone Rugby Union team established themselves as quite a force in the game in the north of England. I think they went 5 years without losing a game at home, did Featherstone. They prided themselves on being a very strong team to beat. So I think you haven't asked me that question yet, but if you were to ask me the question, why does it appeal to Featherstone? It appeals to Featherstone initially because it's a good rough and tumble game that they can join in with, but it also grows here very quickly because that team is successful. And with success comes know-how. And very, very quickly you get people who are skilled in not just playing the game, but coaching the game, training the game, running the game, knowing how to run a club. So all these things develop at the same time. So by the 1890s, Featherstone has got a very successful team.
And I suppose that sort of leads me into my second question to you. And that in other coal sort of boom towns within Wakefield, so Altofts, where I'm from, rugby failed to grow roots. It never really established roots. And a big part of that is often put down to the fact that many people came from Staffordshire, where rugby didn't really have the popularity and people played, and that's why Altofts is a football team and it's never really had a rugby team professionalised. I know in Featherstone you also have a lot of people from Staffordshire. Is it something distinct in that about Featherstone, do you think, that, or do you think it's a bit of a chance?
Yeah, I've thought about this over years. Why hasn't Wakefield got a professional association football team, for instance? It's the only city in Britain without a professional association football team. It is chance, I think. I think the answer to the... I'm doing this in reverse now, aren't I? The answer to the Wakefield question, why haven't they got a professional soccer team, is because they had an highly successful rugby team. Wakefield Trinity was one of the preeminent rugby union teams of the time, and then became an important rugby league team. Well, if you've got that, it's highly unlikely that you'll then have a soccer team as well. Similar thing happened in Hull. All Kingston Rovers and all were very successful rugby teams, weren't they? Which means that, the soccer team don't get the same look in. I think I answered the question in the previous answer. Featherstone quickly established a successful rugby team, and it makes a difference then. Because Altofts and Normanton did have a rugby team. Normanton had quite a successful rugby team, but they couldn't hold on. They weren't as successful. So I think the answer to the question is, if you've got a town where rugby appeals and the team is successful, then it's going to hold on and keep going through the years. Whereas if that team wasn't quite as successful, it don't catch on, and then they have a look at soccer. There's a perfect example of it, actually. Leeds United. They started out as a rugby league team called Holbeck, and Holbeck weren't a very successful rugby league team, so they decided to try their hands at soccer, and they did, and eventually they became Leeds United. Yeah. So there you go.
And Featherstone Rovers didn't form until, I might be wrong on this, but 1912 I've got. You say 1902, didn't you?
1902.
But that's relatively late on for a team to form, I suppose, in a big team. So what came before? Because you've written, haven't you, about the different teams in Featherstone. So could you tell us a little bit about what came before and how those teams coalesced into one?
Yeah, it's just the name that came late, really. Rugby was established in Featherstone from the 1880s. It's just that the name Featherstone Rovers didn't appear till 1902. Again, a brief history. The Featherstone team that started from the cricket team became a team called Featherstone Rugby Union team, and they played on some fields back at where Jubilee Hotel was. It was called the New Inn Fields in those days. It was a pub called the New Inn. They quickly became one of the top teams in Yorkshire. But then came the split. In 1895, there's the infamous split where the Northern Rugby Union teams decided to pull away from English Rugby Union because English Rugby Union wouldn't allow them to be paid any broken time money. Saturday was a working day, as you know, in the Victorian times, and in order to play on a Saturday, they had to forfeit a wage. They had to forfeit a day's wage. So the successful teams were a bit more flush with money, said, OK, well, if you have a day off from work, we'll pay you. So that's what happened. Featherstone didn't immediately switch to rugby league. They carried on with rugby union for a while. But in 1898, 3 years after, a lot of the top Yorkshire teams and Lancashire teams have switched to rugby league. Featherstone decided to switch to rugby league. But they didn't immediately go into the upper echelons of the game. They had to play in the junior section. And that was all right, but they didn't get attractive fixtures. So after about 3 years, they failed. As did a lot of other rugby league teams on that second tier. They just couldn't sustain it, paying wages and playing not so attractive matches. If they'd have been playing your St Helens and your Wigans and your Leedses, yes, of course they'd have done it, but they weren't. They were playing Outwood Church and Normanton and Pontefract and local teams. So the first experiment in rugby league failed. That was 1901. Come 1902, as I've said, George Johnson's working as who was a Staffordshire man, by the way. He's working as a barman at the Featherstone Hotel. Mr. Umpleby, who owns the railway hotel, Mr. Umpleby, who owns the railway hotel, says, look, well, I've got a field down Post Office Road. If you form a team, you can play on my field. So he forms Featherstone Rovers. And that team lasted until 1906. And they were so successful, they failed because of their own success. Within a couple of years, they had some of the best players going. But all the top teams cherry-picked them and enticed them away from Featherstone Rovers. In 1906, Featherstone Rovers got to the last 8 of the Challenge Cup. Now, they were a junior team. It's unheard of for a local junior side to get to the last 8 of a national competition. The Rugby League Challenge Cup, the most prestigious cup, and Featherstone got to the last 8. They would have been in semi-final. They only lost 3-0. They played at Keighley. And the Keighley captain said, at the end of the game, he said, look, we've won 3-0. He said, I'm glad we have. I'm relieved because if it had been a draw, I wouldn't have brought my team to Featherstone because I'd have been too frightened. So they would have been at last 4. But the season after, all them top players who were playing for Featherstone Rovers had gone. They all went to sign for big clubs. Hunslet took loads of the top Featherstone players. So that failed. So in 1908, they started again. And that team then lasted until, 1921, when in 1921 they came into the big professional league. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the
sort of history,
kind of genesis of the club. Yeah.
Fast forward into the 20th century, and rugby league used to attract. It still does. Huge audiences. And there's a famous book called Colours Our Life, which was a study in the early 1950s of Featherstone, and they put down that it used to attract a huge audience, well over half the population of the town. So, what does rugby league mean to a community like Featherstone? I know you've sort of pulled it there that it's an identity thing, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
It's such a complicated question, and it's a very complicated answer. It's a focal point for a start off. If you've got a small community that is punching far above its weight at something, which is what Featherstone's done over the years with rugby, it has to start from a focal point. And at that famous Post Office Road ground, you have got something that's smack bang in the middle of the town for a start off. It's almost like a church, for want of a better description, where you would attend en masse to celebrate and worship your heroes. In the 1990s, I met a German sports journalist called Christoph Biermann, and he was writing for the Stern magazine, the famous German Stern magazine, and they'd asked him to do a piece about rugby league. He ended up with a cover story. It was a 7 or 8 page piece. He stopped at my house for 2 weeks, and he came to love rugby because he saw rugby was still that closely linked to community and closely linked to where it was from. It had its identity, and he called his piece "The Knights of Rugby." And he called it the knights, meaning that, the old
Medieval.
the medieval knights who somehow represented you. These were men who worked alongside you perhaps during the week, but represented you at the weekend with their athletic ability. And let's not forget that these were highly trained athletes. Some of them, they weren't just. I don't know. Fat puffing blokes who were out of breath by half time. They were strong, fit men. So you've got this group of strong, fit blokes representing your town. You've got your focal point with your stadium in the middle of the town. You've got within walking distance something to look forward to. So you come out your front door and there's somebody else coming out of their front door and somebody else coming out of their front door, and you walk together. It's almost ritualistic then. So yeah, what I'm talking about is classic small town belief in something that is important on a weekend. There's a lot more to it than that.
Definitely.
But that's one way in.
Yeah. And with the 80s and 90s and the close of the collieries in Featherstone after the strike in 1984-85, did the sport help to keep alive community pride and community spirit, do you think? A Featherstone identity that was probably quite closely linked to mining?
Yeah, I think it still does, in that sense. The pits were always good to the rugby fans. And the rugby club was always good to the people who worked at the pit. During strikes, people are allowed into matches free and paid back when they could at end of strike. There was that. I forgot the word now. Well, it's an interreliance, is what I'm trying to suggest. I was talking to Pete Smith only a few weeks ago. Peter Smith was an international rugby league player born in Featherstone, and he played for his hometown team, but he worked at the local pit as well. And he told me that on training nights, he'd often walk down railway line front pit yard and see the floodlights of training lights at Featherstone Stadium on and know where he were going, and even as late as 1983, when Featherstone last won the Challenge Cup, 10 out of the 13 men who played at Wembley that day worked not only at the pit, but at the same pit. They worked at Acton Hall Colliery. That'll never be done again.
No, it's almost impossible to think.
It's impossible to think it. It's impossible to think it at the time. 1983, as late as 1983, a team of coal miners win a national competition with a gang of mates.
At Wembley?
At Wembley, in front of nearly 100,000 people. With people they're going to see on Monday morning at work. It's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah. It's almost. Could you imagine a Premier League team?
No, not in 1980s. No, it's not.
No, it's impossible. And yeah, to wrap up, Ian, could you just tell the listeners about, because you've written on rugby, but I know you've worked on numerous projects over the years, and what upcoming projects do you have now? Because I know you've been working on something about Featherstone history that's coming out quite soon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always. I think local is the most important thing you can do. Is be interested in where you're from, and that tells you who you are, and the accessibility of local is something that always appeals to me. There was a poet from he was a toff from Clydeston Hall. They called him Robert Monckton Milnes. He was a wealthy toff, but he fancied himself as a bit of a poet. And he wrote, "A man's best things are close to him, lie close about his feet," which is a nice thing to say. And I watched a television programme, about people who'd found something important in their life. And what struck me was how close it was to where they were from that they found it. There's a very famous boat from ancient times. It's called the Hazome boat. It's from East Yorkshire. And an archaeologist was in a field one day, somewhere between Goole and Driffield, in a muddy field, and he noticed this ancient piece of wood, and he kicked it with his foot, and he thought, this is something special. And it was the rib from this ancient boat. And over a period of time, this archaeologist brought a team in and they uncovered it. And they uncovered a huge boat that had been made from one huge primeval tree, hollowed out, that took about 40 or 50 men to row. And there it was in this muddy field in East Yorkshire. But the interesting thing of all is, that archaeologist had played in that field as a kid. Now, there's something that tunes you in, isn't there, to where you're from. I took the same series, I talked to another bloke, and his family had a tea bar at the end of Filey Brig. And he, as a kid, he worked there. And when he was like in his 30s or 40s, he came back to work in the family tea bar. And he was looking out from the tea bar one day onto rocks on end of Filey Brig, and he saw this unusual stone glinting in the sun, and he went to examine it. And it turned out that it were a coffin lid from a stone sarcophagus from some Norman warrior, 1,000 years old. But it had always been there. And he'd never noticed it, but one day he did. At close proximity. So there's something about distance and proximity and where you're from that really appeals to me. I think, it's just there if we look.
Yeah, there's so much beneath the surface, isn't there? And
close beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And close, not just close beneath the surface, but close around us. It's within touching distance sometimes if we look. It's so close. Yeah, and with that kind of closeness and proximity in mind, I'll just finish off with this. I had an allotment on what they call Featherstone Green allotments. It's just on Featherstone Lane, near where I live. And my partner Heather and the kids, my children, grew up on planting food on that allotment and eating our own food. And one day I'd just finished a row of tatties. I used to smoke in them days. I rolled a cig and I just knelt down having my cig. And again the sun just glinted on something in soil. And I thought, what's that? And I went across and examined it, and it was a round coin-like disc. So I took it down to the allotment tap and I swilled it under the tap, and a pattern started to emerge. And on one side were like a fleur-de-lis, and on the other side there were the winged lion of, I think it's Saint Mark. Mm-hmm. The winged lion.
Yeah, it is.
And so I took it. Oh, I thought, what the bloody hell's this? I took it to the museum and at Pontefract, and Richard Van Reel looked at it. He said, "Where have you found that?" I said, "I found it on my allotment." He said, "You never have." I said, is it something good? He said, yeah, it's a medieval jeton. And it was... Jetons were used in place of money by merchants. Can you imagine that it's just been lying on my allotment all them years, for 500 or 600 years, just waiting for me to finish a row of taties one day to find it. And I've got it. I made a little history about it and framed it up. I've got it in a little frame. What a lovely thing.
Yeah.
We should always look round us. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture of Coal, Wakefield Stories, with me, Alfie Norris and Ian Clayton. If you've enjoyed what you've been listening to, you can follow on the journey by listening and subscribing on Spotify, YouTube, Facebook and other social media. We've got some exciting stories coming up, so I hope you can listen along as the journey continues. Thank you.